therapist once told a client something that stopped him cold. She said, "I've been seeing you for 2 years, and I think I've been trying to fix something that was never broken." He was 41, divorced once, had walked away from 2 serious relationships before that. On paper, he looked like someone who couldn't sustain connection, someone who kept running, someone with unresolved wounds stacked neatly behind his polished exterior, but she'd finally caught it. The pattern wasn't damage. His nervous system wasn't scarred. He wasn't sabotaging anything out of fear. He genuinely, measurably, functionally thrived when he was operating alone. And every time he had tried to build a life that matched what the people around him said a good life looked like, something in him went dim, not dramatically, just steadily. That therapist had the courage to question her own framework. Most people never do. This is Psyche Shift. We cover the psychology that mainstream conversations tend to get halfway right before they lose the thread entirely, and today we're pulling the thread all the way through, because the psychology of men who are genuinely happier alone is one of the most misread topics in the entire space of human behavior, and the cost of that misreading is real. So let's get something straight right out of the gate. There is a massive difference between a man who is alone because he hasn't been able to build what he wanted, and a man who is alone because he has been completely honest with himself about what actually works for his mind, his body, and his sense of self. The first guy is in pain. The second guy is, in many cases, running on all cylinders. And the reason most people can't tell them apart is that both look identical from the outside. They're both single, they both spend a lot of time by themselves, neither one has a partner texting them good morning. But psychologically, emotionally, neurologically, they are having entirely different experiences, and treating them the same way is like looking at 2 people lying in a bed and assuming they're both sick because they're both horizontal. This is where the real conversation starts. Before we get into behavior, we need to go one layer deeper, because a lot of what gets labeled as preference or personality in these conversations is actually neurological architecture. And that matters. Psychologist Hans Eysenck spent decades building a model of personality that held up across cultures and decades of scrutiny. One of its cornerstones was this idea: introverts have a naturally elevated baseline of cortical stimulation, meaning their central nervous system is already generating a higher level of internal activity than the average person's. Picture it like this: 2 cars, both idling in a parking lot. One is sitting at 600 RPMs, the other is already running at 1,800. When you press the gas, both engines respond. But the one already running hot doesn't need nearly as much input before it's operating at full capacity. For the high baseline brain, a quiet Sunday morning with coffee and a book already has the engine humming. Add a packed social schedule on top of that, and you're not adding fuel, you're flooding it. What gets called antisocial or withdrawn in these men is often just appropriate self-regulation. They are managing their neurological load. The retreat isn't emotional, it's physiological. Now layer on top of that a trait psychologists refer to as need for cognition, an intrinsic, almost gravitational pull toward internal processing, toward sitting with ideas, examining experiences, working through complexity inside their own heads. Men who score high here don't just tolerate quiet. They rely on it the same way an athlete relies on recovery time. Without it, they're not performing at full capacity. With it, they're functioning at a level that genuinely satisfies them. What do you do with this? Stop diagnosing your own preferences through other people's neurological experiences. If you grew up surrounded by people who recharge through social activity and assumed that was the only valid model, there's a very real chance you've been measuring yourself against a standard that was never designed for how you're built. Different nervous systems have different requirements. That's biology, not biography. Let's talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough airtime in these conversations: how differently people experience the need for personal control. In 1985, psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan developed what became known as self-determination theory, a framework that's held up remarkably well across 40 years of research and cross-cultural study. Their core claim was that human beings have 3 fundamental psychological needs: competence, relatedness, and autonomy. Remove any one of them long enough, and well-being erodes. But here's the part that gets glossed over. People don't experience these 3 needs at equal intensities, and for a specific subset of men, autonomy isn't just one need among 3, it's the gravitational center around which the other 2 orbit. For these men, having their schedule dictated by someone else's emotional availability isn't a minor irritation. It registers as a genuine threat to psychological stability. The constant negotiation that close relationships require, over time, over space, over how a Tuesday evening gets spent, doesn't feel like a reasonable trade-off. It feels like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small. You can do it. You can walk around in them all day. But something is always slightly, persistently wrong. Think about a man named Adrian. Spent the better part of a decade cycling through relationships that all followed the same arc. The beginning was fine, exciting even. But by the 6-month mark, the same feeling would surface. A low hum of constriction. Not a dislike of his partner, not a failure of love, just this. Persistent, almost physical awareness that some version of himself was being held in a shape that didn't fit. He went to therapy, worked through his family history, examined his attachment patterns, did the work, genuinely. And what he found wasn't unresolved trauma at the root of his pattern. What he found was that his need for autonomy was so structurally central to his sense of self that a relational model built on daily interdependence was always going to press against it. Not because relationships are bad, because this particular relationship model was built for a different psychological profile than the one he actually had. The moment he stopped treating that discovery as a diagnosis and started treating it as data, something shifted. The question stopped being what's wrong with me and became what kind of life actually works for me. That's not avoidance, that's clarity. So, what do? Pay attention to the difference between adjustment and chronic suppression. Every relationship asks you to adjust. That's just what it means to share space with another human. But if the adjustment has become the baseline state of your existence, if you feel like the full version of yourself only surfaces when no one else is around, that gap is worth examining with honesty rather than shame. Here's something that a lot of psychology content dances around without ever landing on directly. Social interaction isn't emotionally neutral for everyone. For people with high extroversion, people whose baseline stimulation runs low, interaction with others is generative. They come away from a dinner party or a group conversation with more energy than they walked in with. Social contact is, for them, literally replenishing. For people built differently, it's a transaction. Value can be exchanged, yes, but something is also spent, and after enough spending, the account runs empty and needs time to rebuild before you can engage again at full capacity. This isn't a weakness. It's a feature of a particular neurological setup. But the cultural story we tell about it is almost entirely negative. The man who needs significant amounts of alone time after social interaction gets labelled as cold, as difficult, as emotionally unavailable. So he learns to push through, to perform the extroversion expected of him. And he pays for that performance in ways that don't have clean names. A creeping irritability that he can't trace to any single cause. A sense of relief that surfaces every time plans get cancelled. An emotional flatness that settles in after weekends full of social obligation. The psychologist Elena Ron spent years researching what she called the highly sensitive person, a trait marked by deep processing of sensory and emotional information, combined with a lower threshold for overstimulation. Her research found that roughly 20% of the population carries this trait, and for men in this category, the performance of social normalcy isn't just uncomfortable, it's genuinely costly in ways that accumulate over time. Now here's the piece that changes the narrative completely. These same men, high autonomy, high internal processing, low baseline stimulation need, often form relationships of extraordinary depth when they do connect. Not frequent ones, not casual ones. but the kind of connections that go somewhere real, where the conversation has actual weight, where presence doesn't require a performance. One or two of those friendships, maintained over years, can be more nourishing to this kind of man than a packed social calendar with a dozen surface-level relationships. What do? Reframe your metric. I should have more people in my life is a social norm, not a psychological law. The more honest question is whether the connections you have are actually feeding something real in you, or whether you're maintaining them out of obligation to a standard that was never designed for your wiring. Quality over quantity isn't a consolation prize. For some people, it's the only model that actually works. There's a trait that keeps surfacing in research on men who thrive in extended solitude, and it might be the most counterintuitive one on this entire list. Because it's not a deficit, it's actually a developmental achievement. Developmental psychologist Erik Erikson mapped out the stages of psychosocial growth across a human lifespan. One of the central ones, identity formation, is the process through which a person builds a stable, coherent sense of who they are, what they stand for, what matters to them, how they want to engage with the world. Most people build this sense of self in relationship to others. They need the feedback, the mirroring, the social context to understand themselves. But a subset of men build it internally, through reflection, through solitude, through years of honest self-examination that doesn't require an audience or a collaborator. The result is what psychologists sometimes call a strong internal locus of identity, a self-concept that doesn't depend on external validation to stay intact. For these men, being alone doesn't create a vacuum. There's no absence of the feedback loop they rely on, because they weren't relying on that loop in the first place. Their sense of who they are doesn't expand or contract based on whether someone else is confirming it on a daily basis. It just holds. Picture a man named Elliot, spent his mid-30s in a long relationship that he describes, looking back, as genuinely loving but quietly dissolving. Not because anything terrible happened, but because he noticed gradually that he was becoming a slightly less precise version of himself. The relationship required constant social calibration, adjusting tone, adjusting availability, adjusting priorities. He did it willingly. But over time, the accumulated weight of that calibration was blurring something in him. When the relationship ended, and he stepped into living alone, he didn't crumble the way everyone expected. He sharpened. His thinking got clearer. His sense of his own values got more specific. He slept better. He worked better. He wasn't lonely. He was more himself than he'd been in years. That's not a red flag. That's what happens when a man with a strongly internalized identity stops doing the continuous cognitive work of social adjustment and starts operating from his own center again. Think about it this way. If your sense of self is a building, most people are constantly renovating it based on input from the people around them. They need that renovation to feel alive and connected. But for this particular type of man, the building was finished a while ago. He knows every room. He knows what works and what doesn't. And every time someone moves in and starts knocking down walls, the structure gets weaker rather than stronger. What do? Ask yourself the honest version of this question. When you're alone, truly alone, no phone, no distraction, does the quiet feel like something missing, or does it feel like something returning? The answer to that question cuts through a lot of confusion very quickly. Now we need to address the version of this that goes wrong. Because this isn't an argument that solitude is always healthy, or that men who prefer it are always self-aware. There's a version of aloneness that is avoidance dressed up as self-sufficiency. A man who stays alone because intimacy scares him. Because vulnerability feels dangerous. Because somewhere along the line he got hurt badly enough that closeness now registers as threat, and his nervous system has been quietly organising his life to keep that threat at a safe distance. That version exists, it's real, and it causes suffering. The line between the two isn't visible from the outside. You can't tell by looking at someone's living situation whether they're thriving in solitude or hiding in it, but from the inside, The distinction is felt clearly if you're willing to be honest about it. Avoidance-based solitude feels like relief from danger. Authenticity-based solitude feels like alignment with self. The first one still has an emotional charge attached to the idea of closeness, anxiety, defensiveness, a subtle tension whenever connection gets too near. The second one simply has a preference, not a wound, not a wall, just a clear, calm recognition that this arrangement fits. Most people who assess men who live alone apply a single template. Something must be wrong. The presumption is always that the natural state is partnership, and that deviation from it requires explanation. But that framework is built on a statistical majority and elevated to a moral standard, and that's a logic error. What's common isn't automatically what's right for every nervous system, every temperament, every psychological structure on the planet. What does the research actually say? Studies examining the relationship between social connection and well-being consistently find that quality of self-relationship, called intrapersonal coherence in some of the literature, predicts life satisfaction at roughly the same level as quality of interpersonal relationships. Men who have built a rich, honest, nourishing relationship with their own inner life don't experience the same deficit from limited external connection that men who haven't done that work would experience. The foundation is different, and when the foundation is different, the structure built on top of it looks different too. Let that land. Because the goal of this isn't to validate isolation or dismiss the genuine value of human connection. It's to create space for an honest question. What does your particular mind and body and psychology actually require to function at its best? Not what your family expects, not what the culture prescribes, not what you've been told a healthy adult is supposed to want. What actually works for you. The therapist we opened with, the one who finally told her client that she'd been trying to fix something that wasn't broken, said something else in that session worth repeating. She said, "The bravest thing isn't always choosing connection. Sometimes the bravest thing is choosing honesty about what you actually need, even when it doesn't fit the story everyone else is telling about what a good life looks like. That client isn't alone because he failed. He's alone because he paid attention, because he stopped outsourcing his own self-knowledge to cultural scripts and relationship timelines, and the well-meaning but ultimately generic advice of people who assumed their experience was universal. The men who genuinely thrive in solitude aren't broken versions of men who should be partnered. They're a specific psychological type. High internal processing, strong autonomy drive, elevated cortical baseline, deeply rooted sense of self whose authentic functioning happens to look unconventional to the people around them. None of that needs to be fixed. All of it needs to be understood. And if you've been sitting with this video feeling like something in it is describing an experience you've never quite had words for, that recognition matters. Not as permission to stop growing or to avoid the harder work of self-examination, but as a starting point for building a life that's actually built for you, rather than assembled from borrowed expectations. Because the version of you that operates at full capacity, the version that's clear, grounded, genuinely well, that version probably looks a specific way. Pay attention to it. Trust what it's telling you. That's not giving up on connection. That's finally being honest about what connection actually means for someone like you.